The outpost yard stank of whiskey and sweat, the board spitting heat under a noon sun as the widow stood alone, her shawl ripped from her shoulders by two laughing troopers, the jeers of men rattling the rafters like tin in a storm. Her hands clutched at the rags left to her, nails biting skin, face gone white as lime, while the captain sneered that thieves ought to be searched proper before the crowd. Fingers clawed at her sleeve, tugging rough, and her knees sagged as shame burned hotter than the sun. The air itself held its breath, and then boots thudded slow on the dust, the sound carrying heavier than a gunshot. A drifter no one had marked before stepped through the ring, his coat long and gray with trail miles, dust clinging like scars, his eyes lowered but hard as iron in shadow. He didn't speak, didn't posture, only lifted the coat from his shoulders in one steady motion and wrapped it round her body, pulling the cloth close against her trembling skin. For a heartbeat the yard froze, mouths hanging open, dust motes spinning in the sunlight like sparks over water. The coat smelled of wood smoke and leather, the weight of it falling like mercy across her bones. The captain barked, "Step aside, stranger, this ain't your business." But the drifter's hand stayed on her shoulder, light yet unyielding, and his gaze rose at last, black wells that showed no fear and no hurry, only a silence sharp enough to draw blood. Murmurs curled through the crowd, shame flickering in eyes that had jeered seconds before. The trooper who held her sleeve let go as if it had turned to fire, and the captain's grin warped into a snarl. "So you mean to play, hero?" he spat, pistol heavy at his hip, spurs clinking like knives in glass. The drifter said nothing, just shifted his weight so his coat enclosed her like a wall. The hush thickened, broken only by the creak of saddle leather as men leaned forward, watching a spark catch tinder. The widow gripped the coat's lapels with fists shaking not from cold, but from the shock of being shielded when no one else had lifted a finger. Somewhere a horse stamped, dust pluming, the sound rolling through the yard like thunder under a storm not yet cracked. The captain's hand drifted down to his gun. "Last chance, trail rat," he drawled, voice hot with mockery but eyes twitching under the drifter's steady silence. "Step back or I'll strip you of skin instead." The drifter let his free arm fall, hand brushing the length of chain coiled at his belt. Iron links that whispered faint as a snake's hiss. His voice came then, low and calm, but carrying over every plank and every throat. "You'll take nothing more from her." No shout, no threat, just a sentence cut from stone. The words hit harder than a whip, and for a breath the sun itself seemed to pause, hanging heavy as judgment. The captain's face flushed, laughter choking in his chest as the men at his back shifted, unease prickling their spines. Ada felt her knees lock steady for the first time since morning, the coat tight at her chin, her heart hammering against cloth that smelled of earth and fire. The silence deepened, then broke as the captain snarled for his men to seize them both, and the yard bristled with hands reaching for iron. In that instant, Ada understood something had shifted forever. A drifter she did not know had stepped into her shame and carried it like his own, and the whole outpost would bleed before he let them lay hands on her again. The yard exploded as the captain's snarl ripped the air, men lunging forward with fists and steel, boots hammering dust that rose in choking clouds, their laughter gone sharp as knives. Ada clutched the coat tighter around her chest, her breath snagging in her throat as fear clawed her belly. But the drifter moved before the first hand reached her, his chain flashing out like a struck serpent, links singing bright in the sun as they wrapped a trooper's wrist and yanked him sideways into the dirt with a crunch of bone and a scream that scalded the silence. Pistols rasped from holsters, iron glinting blue as the crowd scattered in a storm of boots and curses, but the drifter turned slow, calm as if the storm belonged to him, and the weight in his eyes made men falter on their draw. The captain bellowed, red in the face, his pistol ripping free, but before he fired, the drifter jerked his wrist and the chain lashed up, sparks spitting from the barrel as it slapped the gun aside, the shot blasting wild into the sky. Horses reared at the crack, shrieking with foam at their teeth, and the crowd shrank back against the clapboard walls, faces pale as chalk. Ada's pulse hammered so loud she thought the whole yard could hear it, the coat heavy with smoke and sweat around her shoulders, her knees trembling but her eyes locked on the man who had stepped into her shame without asking her name. Another trooper rushed in, knife flashing, and the drifter let the chain coil back with a hiss before swinging it wide, the links cracking across the man's jaw with a sound like ice splitting on a river. Blood spattered hot across the boards, painting Ada's skirts in flecks that steamed under the sun, and her stomach twisted but her feet rooted as if the coat itself pinned her to the ground. "Seize him!" the captain roared, his voice cracking, but the words rang hollow against the hush bleeding from the onlookers who had once cheered. Their eyes slid away, guilt cutting deeper than the drifter's chain. Still, 3 men charged together, teeth bared, and Ada cried out as they slammed into him, fists pounding, steel scraping, the weight of bodies driving him sideways into the dirt. Dust swallowed them in a choking veil, grunts and curses clashing like iron on stone, and for a breath she thought the fight was over. Then the chain burst out of the cloud, whistling through air, biting into a throat so hard the sound of it snapping rang clean as a bell. One man fell, boots twitching, while the drifter rolled free, coatless, his shirt torn and blood soaking through from a gash across his ribs. His eyes caught hers in the chaos, black, steady, commanding, and her lungs jolted alive as if he had breathed fire into them. The captain stumbled back, his pistol shaking now, sweat streaking his red face. "He's one man!" he barked, but no one moved. The crowd's murmurs grew, shame whispering like dry grass in the wind, and the captain's snarl faltered under the weight of silence that favored the drifter. Ada felt her hands clench into the coat's lapels, her fear burning into something hotter, harder. The man who had covered her stood bleeding, ringed by enemies and ghosts of law, and yet he grinned, small, crooked, defiant, as if blood was only proof that he still stood. When the captain raised his pistol again, she knew the outpost was about to learn what it cost to strip a woman of her dignity under the wrong man's eyes. Dust swirled heavy as powder smoke across the yard, the stink of blood and sweat choking the air, men frozen with pistols half drawn, eyes cutting to the captain but feet unwilling to move. Ada's fingers locked in the coat's lapels, her heart a hammer under her breastbone, every beat louder than the silence closing round the outpost like a noose. The drifter straightened slow, ribs heaving, shirt torn wide to show a scar carved deep across his flank, a mark that made the captain's face blanch, then knot with rage. Recognition sparked ugly in the air, sharper than steel, and the captain spat. "Mercer, thought I left you in a ditch east of Bighorn." The crowd murmured, voices hissing through the dust, and Ada felt her pulse stumble. Mercer, the name cutting like a knife through whispers of outlaw and deserter. A past dripping red that clung to this man like smoke. The drifter's grin twitched, small and crooked, his eyes black wells that showed no shame. "You left me chained," he rasped, voice rough as gravel dragged through glass. "And you branded my arm so the world would call me thief. Took more than your rope to kill me." His branded forearm lifted, scar tissue raw in the sunlight, flesh melted in the shape of an iron's cruel bite. Gasps rippled the yard, shame prickling in faces now pale, and Ada's throat closed on a cry she could not shape. The captain barked for his men to seize him, voice cracking with desperation. But no one moved. Their eyes slid to Mercer's scar and back to the pistol shaking in the captain's fist. Ada's stomach churned with ice and fire, both. The man who had covered her was not just a drifter, but a ghost risen from their own cruelty, his coat a shield carried from ashes no one had dared face. The boy inside her memory, the day her husband's coffin dragged past this same outpost, the jeers still raw, rose and collided with the sight before her, and she realized this man bled not only for her, but against the same lash that had once torn her life. The captain, cornered by silence heavier than any jury, snarled through his teeth and yanked the trigger. The shot cracked, deafening, iron flame biting the dust where Mercer had stood a blink before, and Ada screamed as smoke belched thick, the crowd scattering like startled cattle. Mercer lunged through the haze, chain hissing bright, wrapping the captain's gun hand and jerking it hard so bones popped loud. The pistol clattering to boards. Their bodies slammed together, fists and curses thundering, the chain whipping arcs of sparks as men flinched back from a storm, not theirs to touch. Ada's chest heaved, torn between terror and awe, the coat heavy on her shoulders, blood on its hem dark as tar. She understood then the twist of fate binding them. This wasn't mercy alone. This was a reckoning carved years before, a man returning not only to shield her, but to drag judgment across the yard that had once stripped him of name and flesh. The captain roared, teeth red, but Mercer only laughed low, hoarse, a sound that rattled the boards like iron shaken in a box. "You made me ghost," he said, dragging him down into the dust. "Now I haunt what you built." The words cracked louder than the gunshot. And Ada knew nothing in this outpost would stay standing by nightfall. The chain rattled through dust and blood as Mercer dragged the captain down hard, boots thudding hollow on the boards, a cry tearing loose that was more rage than pain. The yard trembled with the weight of silence. The onlookers pressed against clapboard walls, their eyes white coins in the smoke. Ada clutched the coat tighter, its weight like armor, her breath breaking in ragged pulls as she watched the man who had covered her shoulders tear open the shame of this place. The captain spat dust and tried to lunge, but Mercer's knee drove into his chest with a crack that rang like a green log splitting. "This post runs on lies," Mercer rasped, voice shredding through the haze. "And every chain here remembers my name." His branded arm swung into the captain's face, scarred flesh smacking bone. And the sight made Ada shudder, not from horror, but from the ghost of recognition, a wound that felt carved in her own skin. The troopers flanking froze, pistols half lifted, fear chewing their hands, their eyes darting from Mercer's chain to the crowd already murmuring like a river rising in flood. One barked, "Orders, sir!" But the captain's gasp came only as blood and spit, teeth rattling in his skull. The drifter turned his head slow, gaze sweeping the ring of soldiers, his eyes black lamps glowing out of the ruin of his face. "You follow his law, you'll hang with it," he said, and his words cut the yard deep, carving hesitation into men who had never faltered under uniform. Ada's knees weakened, but she stayed standing, her chin lifting, something rising in her chest that tasted of smoke and steel. She looked around and saw townsfolk creeping from shadows, traders, whores, children with dirt on their cheeks, faces etched with the same scars of fear. Mercer wasn't fighting alone. He was dragging their shame into the open, forcing them to stare. The captain roared raw, heaving with the last spit of strength, and his hand closed on the iron brand that had fallen near the forge ash, its tip still glowing faint orange. He swung wild, searing smoke curling as it slashed past Mercer's ear. Ada screamed as the stink of burned hair filled the air. Mercer caught his wrist. The two men locked, one scar against another, iron spitting between them like the memory of every wrong carved here. "Brand me again," Mercer snarled low, his teeth bright under blood. "But it won't be me wearing shame." The iron hissed close to his own throat, their arms trembling in deadlock, and for a moment it seemed the fire itself would decide who lived. Then gunfire cracked from the wall, bullets zipping past, splintering boards, dust spurting. The troopers had chosen sides. Ada ducked low, clutching the coat around her body and the carved wolf the boy had slipped in her pocket weeks before, her heart jackhammering against cloth that smelled of sweat, blood, and defiance. The crowd shrieked, scattering, horses screaming as their reins snapped free. Mercer twisted, chain snapping tight round the captain's arm, yanking till bone cracked, and the brand dropped into snow, hiss, and steam. "This yard," Mercer roared, hoarse and raw, "is no gallows for widows." His shout carried through the smoke, shaking the men who stood, and Ada saw in their eyes the rope of loyalty fraying. Blood spattered the dust, the air boiling with cries, and as she rose, coat dragging heavy, she knew this battle was not only for her, but for every scar this place had hidden. Gunfire cracked through the smoke, splinters raining from clapboard walls, troopers shouting in panic as Mercer yanked the captain down, chain clattering over boards like a church bell gone mad. Ada crouched low, the coat heavy on her shoulders, her breath ragged with the stink of powder and scorched hair, heart hammering so loud she thought it might draw every bullet. The yard had become a pit of ghosts, townsfolk scattering to alleys, horses screaming, men firing wild into dust, but her eyes locked only on the drifter. He bled steady from his ribs, his face smeared red and ash, yet his stance was iron, his chain lashing arcs that knocked pistols spinning into dirt. The captain lay half-crushed, arm bent wrong, spitting orders no one heeded, his voice thin as paper. Then over the thunder came a new sound, hooves pounding, not scattered but in unison, a roll like war drums beating the earth hollow. Ada froze, blood icing, and Mercer's head lifted slow, his eyes black and knowing. Reinforcements. The outpost gates burst wide with riders surging through, rifles braced, torches flaring like demon tongues in the stormlight. Pike's gang, called by debt and lawless pay, faces twisted with the same grin that had branded Mercer years before. Their leader raised his pistol high and bellowed, "End this! Hang the drifter! Strip the woman clean!" The words slammed Ada like a lash. Her knees wanted to fold, her throat to sob, but something inside her cracked hot instead of cold. She felt the coat's weight, Mercer's gift, his shield, and shame turned to fire in her veins. She rose in the yard, trembling but tall, lifting her chin against the blaze of torches. "You'll not touch him!" The cry ripped from her chest, louder than she thought her lungs could bear. For a moment the chaos stilled, men staring, a widow defying in a coat 2 sizes too big, her voice sharp as a blade. Mercer's eyes burned into hers, shock flickering before it hardened into something fierce, and she knew she had tied her fate to his. A rider spurred forward, rope coiling for her throat, and Ada seized the Winchester dropped by a fallen trooper, her hands clumsy but desperate. The lever clacked, the stock bruised her shoulder, and the shot split the yard, blasting the rider from his saddle in a bloom of red mist. Silence cracked. Then the world roared, the crowd gasping, Mercer laughing hoarse through blood, the riders snarling as wolves howled from beyond the wall, their voices low and long, weaving into the smoke like an oath. Ada stood shaking, the rifle hot in her hands, her heart wild but steadying under the weight of what she'd done. She wasn't prey anymore. The drifter grinned crooked, chain hissing as he yanked another man into dust. "Now you're in it," he rasped, and she nodded once, clutching the rifle. The captain spat curses, eyes rolling in fear, but no one listened. The fight belonged to something larger now, something older than uniforms or badges. It was written in scars, blood, and the coat on her shoulders. As the riders circled, torches spitting sparks across the yard, Ada planted her boots beside Mercer's and lifted the Winchester again. The widow who had cowered an hour ago was gone. In her place stood a woman with fire in her chest and a vow burning behind her teeth. The yard burned orange under torchlight, smoke boiling from the forge sled dragged in by Pike's riders, its coals spitting like the mouth of hell, the brand rods glowing dull red in the haze. Ada stood with the Winchester clutched to her shoulder, the coat heavy on her back, her breath raw with smoke and fear, yet steady now, her eyes locked on the ring tightening around them. Mercer swayed at her side, his branded arm limp, blood slick down his ribs, but his grin still hung crooked, teeth white in a face painted red. Pike swung from his saddle, boots crunching dust, his voice rolling like thunder soaked in whiskey. "Mercer! Should have died chained. Now you'll roast in front of her eyes." He jerked the brand from the coals, orange light dripping off it like venom, and the sight punched Ada's gut cold. The crowd moaned. Townsfolk pressed against walls, their shame heavy as stone. The troopers hesitated, fear gnawing at their fingers, but Pike's gang roared louder, rifles raising, rope whistling through the air as they closed. Ada lifted the rifle and fired, the kick jolting her bones. A rider dropped screaming from his horse, blood hissing into dust. For a heartbeat, the yard froze. Then chaos ripped open. Guns cracked, wolves howled from beyond the wall, their hymn rising sharp, slicing the night. And then shadows slithered over the palisade, gray pelts gleaming, eyes burning green in the torch glare. They came silent as smoke, jaws tearing into flesh before the riders knew the wall was breached. Horses shrieked, men toppled, torches dropped and hissed into dirt. Ada's chest surged with something fierce, part terror, part awe, as wolves fanned wide, a living storm weaving through men and iron. Mercer staggered forward, chain dragging sparks, his voice ragged as he barked, "Take the gate!" He slammed into Pike, chain lashing sparks off the brand rod, the two men locked in a glow of fire and blood. Ada bolted to the boy's side, snatching him from behind a barrel, his eyes wide black mirrors that glimmered with wolf-light, his small body trembling but unbroken. "Stay close," she whispered, voice breaking, and planted herself over him, the Winchester hot against her ribs. The fight roared around them, gunfire chewing boards, wolves ripping throats, men screaming as the yard became a pit of blood and fire. Pike shoved Mercer back, the brand hissing close to his chest, but Mercer's chain snapped tight round his wrist, searing skin, yanking the iron free. It fell into dirt with a hiss. Sparks flying, Pike howled, teeth bared, and drove a knife into Mercer's side, the blade vanishing up to hilt. Ada screamed, stumbling towards them, but Mercer only laughed, blood spilling down his shirt like wine. His grin split wider as he dragged Pike close, whispering words lost under the wolf's howl, then slammed his head into the man's face with a crack that sprayed blood into firelight. Ada fired again, the slug tearing through a rider lunging for her flank, the recoil spinning her but leaving the boy untouched. The wolves closed in, snarls drowning the gunfire, their green eyes bright as lanterns. Ada's lungs burned, her heart galloping wild, but she felt the coat tight round her and knew this fight wasn't just his, it was hers now too. And as Pike staggered back, Mercer bleeding but still standing, Ada raised the Winchester once more and braced for the last storm. The yard stank of blood and smoke, wolves circling low with their muzzles slick red, bodies of riders strewn in the dust where torches sputtered out in black puddles. The forge sled still burned in the center, coals alive with a demon glow, the rods within throbbing orange like molten fangs, spitting sparks into the night. Pike staggered upright, nose broken, face a ruin of blood and rage, yet his voice cut through the chaos, ragged but loud. "Brand him again. Make the whole post see his shame." His gang, what few left breathing, dragged Mercer down by his bleeding side, ropes whipping round his shoulders, boots scouring dirt as he dropped to one knee. Ada cried out, lunging, the Winchester bucking in her hands. But the shot cracked wide, torchlight blinding her eyes as smoke boiled. Rough hands slammed her back. The boy wrenched from her clutch, his scream splitting the dark. A rope tightened on Mercer's throat, choking, his branded arm dragged forward, and Pike stooped to the forge, lifting the iron with a grunt, its tip glowing bright as the sun, heat rippling the air. "Once a thief, always a thief," Pike spat, drool stringing his chin. "We'll write it deeper so no one forgets." Ada's heart thundered, her lungs bursting, shame and fury twining like fire ropes in her chest. She saw Mercer's eyes through the tangle of fists and rope, dark, defiant, unblinking as if daring the iron itself. Her knees wanted to buckle, her hands to fold, but the coat weighed heavy, dragging her spine straight. Her fingers brushed the knife still warm at her hip, and the boy's scream cut through everything else like a bell tolling the end of mercy. Ada shoved off the ground, teeth clenched, shoving past hands that clawed her hair, driving forward with a cry raw enough to split bone. The knife gleamed once, then sank deep into the thigh of the man pinning her, his howl spraying her cheek with spit. She ripped free, snatched the Winchester where it lay, and shouldered it high, her arms steady as iron though her chest shook like a drum. Pike loomed over Mercer, the iron's glow licking his scarred arm, and Ada's shot cracked, smoke ripping her vision as the slug tore through Pike's shoulder. He bellowed, iron clattering to the boards, sparks exploding in a hiss. The yard erupted, wolves surging like smoke-given fangs, men screaming as jaws dragged them down. Ada rushed to Mercer, knife flashing to slice the rope choking his throat, her breath sawing fire. He staggered up, swaying, blood sluicing his side, but his grin crooked through the ruin, teeth white in the red. "Told you," he rasped, voice shredded. "Fire don't own me." Pike slumped against the forge, clutching his wound, snarling through red froth. "Then it'll own her." His pistol scraped free, muzzle swinging on Ada, but Mercer lunged, chain whipping in one last savage hiss. The iron links smashed Pike's jaw with a crack that silenced the night, his gunshot firing wild into the dark before he collapsed into the coals, his scream shrill as his flesh seared in the forge's mouth. The stink of burning man rolled across the yard, wolves howling wild as dawn's first gray slit the sky. Ada dropped the rifle, chest heaving, her hands locked on Mercer's shoulders to hold him up. He laughed once, soft and broken, blood dribbling down his chin. "Coat suits you," he whispered. She clutched it tighter, tears hot in the cold, knowing fire had demanded a name. But she had given it mercy instead. The forge hissed and spat as Pike's screams faded into silence. His body crumpled in the coals, the stink of charred flesh rolling through the yard until even the wolves backed from the heat with growls low as thunder. Ada's chest sawed air, her hands clenched round Mercer's shoulders, feeling the tremor in his bones, his breath rattling like a stovepipe gone loose. The coat hung heavy on her, its hem black with soot and blood, but the weight steadied her spine instead of breaking it. The last of Pike's men scattered for the gate, shouting ragged boot-slapping boards as they fled into the dark. For a heartbeat, Ada thought it was over, until she heard the horn, low and guttural, echoing from beyond the palisade, and her blood froze. Reinforcements, shadows massed outside, rifles glinting where torches burned like a second sunrise. Their voices snarling vengeance. The wolves padded to the gate, fur bristling, their lantern eyes locked on the shapes gathering beyond. Ada's stomach twisted. Mercer couldn't stand, his knees buckling as he leaned hard into her grip, blood pumping steady from the wound in his side. He grinned still, crooked through crimson teeth, but his voice rasped dry as broken glass. "Ain't my fight to finish. It's yours now." The words cut deeper than any blade, her breath choking in her throat. She looked down at the boy crouched in shadow, his small hands clenching the carved wolf he carried like a relic, his eyes black fire fixed on her. Fear wrapped her heart tight, but beneath it came a heat stronger, a spark Mercer had thrown her way when he draped that coat around her shoulders. Ada eased him down against the wall, her hands lingering a moment on his face, then turned and picked up the Winchester. Her boots planted square in the dirt, she raised her chin against the torchlight flooding through the gate. "You'll not take him," she cried, voice raw but sharp as a whip. The yard rang with her words, men pausing beyond the wall, the wolves lifting their heads to howl a chord that braided into the night. Gunfire split the dark, bullets whining through gaps, chewing splinters from the palisade. Ada dropped behind a trough, the rifle steady in her hands, breath hissing through her teeth as she waited. A rider burst through first, torch spitting sparks, and she rose quick, the Winchester barking, slug smashing his chest and pitching him into the dirt. The wolves surged after, gray smoke with teeth, dragging down another before his rifle cleared leather. Ada cycled the lever, fired again, sparks flaring in the dark, her pulse steadying with every crack. Each shot bought seconds, each howl carved space. Still there were too many. Shadows poured into the yard, boots hammering, rifles blazing, voices snarling her name now. Ada gritted her teeth, rage and terror fusing in her chest, and fired until the rifle's chamber clicked empty. For a heartbeat, silence roared. Then the wolves filled the gap, jaws ripping men down in sprays that painted the dawn snow red. Ada stood in the churn, coat whipping in the wind, knife drawn now, her face pale but set. She understood it then. This was the stand Mercer had begun, but it was hers to finish. With the boy at her back, and wolves circling at her side, she planted her boots in blood and dust and met the charge head-on. Dawn bled pale across the yard. A sky of gray bruises cracked with firelight as the last of Pike's men pressed in, rifles snarling, boots grinding ash into the boards where corpses already steamed. Ada stood at the trough, knife in hand, coat dragging heavy, her arms shaking with exhaustion, yet her chin held high. The boy crouched behind her, clutching his carved wolf, eyes wide with a fire too old for his years. Wolves circled low, their fur silvered by the dim light, their growls a constant hymn that threaded fear through the ranks of men. But there were still too many. Shadows rushing the gate, torches flaring like new suns, shouts pounding against her skull. Ada braced herself to die on her feet when a broken laugh rattled from the wall behind her. Mercer. He dragged himself up, one hand braced on the boards. The other clenched around his chain, blood soaking his shirt dark as pitch. His grin gleamed white through the gore, cracked but steady, and his voice grated like rust grinding over stone. "One more dance," he rasped. He lurched forward, every step a stumble, but his presence drew the eyes of every man in the yard. Ada screamed at him to stay down, her throat raw, but he didn't falter. "This ain't yours to carry alone," he croaked, and swung the chain high, its links catching torchlight like molten steel. He staggered into the charge, the chain whipping arcs that cracked skulls and wrenched rifles from hands, his laughter hoarse as wolves poured in with him, jaws flashing like lightning in the storm. Men shrieked, chaos breaking, but Ada saw what he knew. His strength was burning out in this last blaze. Pike's second lunged with a pistol raised, barrel yawning black at Ada's chest. She froze, knife clenched, too far to strike. The gun cracked, but Mercer moved, hurling himself between, the slug punching through his side with a wet smack. His body jolted, knees buckling, yet his arm swung once more, chain whipping the gun aside before his boots gave out. He fell hard, blood spilling in sheets across the boards, his grin fading but never gone. Ada dropped to him, sob choking her throat as she pressed her hands to the wound, heat flooding her palms, slippery as lamp oil. "Don't you dare," she whispered, voice breaking. "Don't you leave me in this hell." His eyes flickered, black coals dimming, and he rasped, "Hell's better with company." Then he coughed red into her hands and wheezed, "Make it mean something." The wolves closed the gap, dragging Pike's men screaming into the dust, their howls rolling like drums across the dawn. The last survivors broke, scattering into the snow, rifles clattering behind them. Ada clutched Mercer tighter, tears blinding her, but the fight was already done. The yard stank of smoke, blood, and victory. She bent her forehead to his hair, shaking, as the boy slid close, his small hand resting on Mercer's still warm chain. "He saved us," Ada whispered, her words torn on the wind, and the boy's eyes burned like a promise as the wolves howled low, mourning and praising both. Mercer's chest stilled beneath her hands, the grin carved faint on his mouth, like a scar etched into eternity. The outpost yard lay broken under dawn, torches guttered to smoke, boards slick with blood that steamed faint against the pale chill. Men's bodies sprawled where wolves had left them, eyes open to a sky they no longer cursed. Ada knelt in the ruin, her hands black with Mercer's blood, the coat draped heavy over her shoulders, its hem scorched and stiff. Beside her the boy crouched silent, the carved wolf clutched tight, his gaze fixed on the drifter who lay still, with his crooked grin faded to peace. Wolves padded the yard's edges, silent now, their muzzles red but their eyes calm, as if the fight had ended not just for men but for the land itself. Ada's chest hitched on a sob she swallowed hard, her fingers brushing the chain coiled in Mercer's slack hand. It was slick with blood, links scarred by fire. A serpent that had sung his last song. His voice echoed in her bones. Make it mean something, and she knew what she must do. She pried the chain from his palm, cold iron kissing her skin, and rose on trembling legs. The boy followed, his small hand warm against hers. Together they walked to the center of the yard, where the forge sled hissed its last breath, coals dimming under frost. Ada dropped to her knees, scooped at the ash and dirt with raw hands until her nails tore, then laid the chain down into the hollow she scraped. It clinked once, a low sound swallowed by the earth. She covered it with ash and blood-soaked soil, each handful a vow. No rope, no brand, no false law would rise again on this ground. When the last link vanished, she pressed her palms flat, her breath ragged but steady, and whispered, "It ends here." The wolves raised their heads as if in answer, a single howl rolling up into the pale sky, long and low, a hymn that braided grief with honor. The boy lifted his carved wolf and set it atop the mound, wood dark with soot, eyes carved deep as if to watch forever. Ada bent, kissed his hair, tears hot against her frozen cheeks. She stood then, turning back to Mercer's body. Kneeling, she pulled the coat from her shoulders and draped it over him, the cloth stained, torn, heavy with smoke, yet still whole. It belonged with him, not her. "You covered me," she whispered, voice breaking. "Now I cover you." The dawn wind tugged at her skirts, carrying the stink of powder away, washing the yard with a hush. She pressed her forehead to the coat one last time, then rose, the boy's hand finding hers again. Together they walked to the gate, past the wolves who parted in silence, green eyes glinting like lanterns in farewell. The boy glanced up, his voice small but steady. "He saved us." Ada swallowed hard, her throat raw, and nodded. "And we'll save what's left." Beyond the walls the snow stretched wide, the horizon bleeding gold where the sun cracked the clouds. The world waited, empty but open. Ada tightened her grip on the boy's hand, her body aching but her heart carved new, no longer cowering under shame. Behind her, the outpost smoldered, its gallows broken, its forge dead. Ahead, wolves loped into the distance, their howls fading, leaving only the echo of a man's last grin and a chain buried deep where fire had once ruled.